Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here at the Asia Society. I'm also delighted that so many of you have showed up on this nice summer evening where you could be at home barbecuing or having a good time and not listening to me. Anyway, I want to jump into right into my short, it's not that short, into my introduction, but I hope to give you a bit of a frame. Basically, when you say North Korea, almost everybody immediately thinks of nuclear weapons, the young leader Kim Jong-un with his, let me say, unique hairstyle, and starving children. Forgotten are the 24 million ordinary people that happen to live there and are struggling to get by day. My first trip was actually in spring 1995, and as you heard already, I'm going in and out there very often. And I must admit, though sometimes considered as being anything between crazy and mad, I still visit North Korea about 3 times a year to follow up on humanitarian projects, do some consulting work, or accompany tour groups. I left North Korea in October 2011. At that time, it was still Kim Jong-il in power. And after that, I spent 2 years at Stanford University. And after that, in 2015, I started a small non-governmental organization in Hong Kong. That was not an easy decision, but because there are only a small number of international aid community actors there, I felt it was worthwhile to stay involved, use the expertise I have and the knowledge I gained through the many years I worked for Caritas and also for the Swiss government, and to continue deepening relationships and trust with the North Korean counterparts. Today, my organization works closely with a semi-governmental organization in North Korea, and we support mainly children and people with disabilities. And I'm sure we talk about that later on. Okay. It reminds me almost of Pyongyang when we had that all the time. Well, as you know, for the past few weeks, Korea has been in the news day by day. And the historic meeting between President Moon from South Korea and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un will took place on the 27th of April. I was there at the end of March, and most North Koreans I had met at that time had no or almost no knowledge about the North-South rapprochement. By now, it has been made public, my colleagues tell me. But plans for a possible, I still say possible, Trump-Kim meeting had at that time also not heard of. I don't know what has changed in the meantime, but I wouldn't be surprised if ordinary North Koreans don't know. Information remains still very controlled. Internet access is for a few privileged people only, but nevertheless, the flow of information has improved. The border to China has become much more porous, and especially residents in the border area are learning much more in terms of what's happening in China and also in South Korea. And then another impact has the people that can travel abroad. North Koreans who can travel abroad, they all come back with new impressions. And of course, that is widely discussed at home or in the beer halls in the evening. I also believe tourists bring in knowledge, bring in change. And then there is television, but of course it's North Korean television, but every Sunday evening they have 45 minutes what the North Koreans call international news. It's a bit of cut and paste. But it's probably the program that is watched by more people than any program otherwise. I was, for example, stunned when all of a sudden the North Koreans started asking me, why are the glaciers shrinking in Switzerland? Well, I had no idea. The Sunday night before it had been on television. So you have those little surprises. But talking politics is not something a North Korean does with a foreigner. But they like to hear about our countries, how we live, what we do, where we travel. Or sports is another good topic to talk about. There is definitely a hunger for information. Learning how the broader world functions has increased among the North Koreans with whom I work. And that is quite a significant change. But life in North Korea for the average person is tough. The main occupation is to make ends meet and to work hard. Everybody belongs to some sort of a work unit at schools, in factories, on cooperative farms, within the government or the military. And during the time that system was functioning fully, the work unit of the male household head was responsible for providing an apartment or a house, for food, clothing, access to health services for his employees. This is changing, but without the work unit, benefits for families shrink. The work unit also decides if a person is allowed to travel, jobs are assigned, and changing is almost impossible. Of the labor force, about 30% are working in the agricultural sector. And all farms were privatized, that had been privatized, were collectivized in 1958 already. And by now we have about 3,000 cooperative farms, and they are responsible to produce the staple food. And that is rice, maize, barley, now also potatoes and soya beans. These farms have anything between 1,000 and 3,000 inhabitants, and there is a village structure in place. They have nurseries, kindergarten, schools, clinics, shops, cinemas, and now also small agro-processing units. And very importantly, farmers have a small garden where they can plant whatever they want and keep, sell, or barter the harvest. And this small plot makes a huge difference in people's lives. Workers are wage earners. They work for the state or in collective enterprises, and that's about 60% of the workforce. They live mostly in apartments rather than houses, and therefore have no access to land, and that makes life much harder. And sometimes you hear chickens on balconies, and I remember when we had a very high-level visitors, and it was just denied that they were keeping pigs on the balcony. We walked past the balcony, and it went, and of course we burst out into laughter. Work is hard, 8 days a week, 8 hours, 5 days a week, 4 hours, 8 hours a day. Saturday I consider work too, because they have to do community service and attend political education. Sunday is, however, family day. So basically, you have these two main groups in the society, and then officials and soldiers. Pyongyang is the capital, is the political, economic, and cultural heart of the country. And the capital is also the city of monumental architecture and strong political symbolism, hosting many of the country's flagship projects. But let me also say Pyongyang had to be rebuilt after the war. There was nothing left, the Korean War, that is. So the city is actually quite nice. It has open space, it has parks and wide boulevards, but very few traditional style housing are left. Another question you may know from the press, are those streets really always so empty? Well, let me say yes and no. Journalists have the ability to always go on a Sunday to take photos of the streets, because on Sunday cars are not allowed to drive. But traffic is, of course, not what we have in Beijing or Bangkok. Thank God. But it is much more than what was there some years ago. And in Pyongyang alone, we have 5 taxi companies competing with each other. That means people can take taxis. We also have a lot of new buildings in Pyongyang. Visitors are usually very surprised to find really, really tall buildings. The tallest one has 72 floors. And then people are using mobile phones nowadays. Girls are wearing more modern clothing. High heels are in fashion. And there are also many new restaurants. And those with some money like to go out and eat out. What is also striking, especially when you come from Beijing, is that there's no advertisements in North Korea. The first commercial billboard for locally produced cars appeared in 2004. And as of today, there are only few of these billboards. Otherwise, the strong propaganda posters provide for the bright colors. And during the famine years, which were horrible years, you would hardly see any children outdoors. Now, they are having a good time playing in already existing playgrounds. Many were built during the Kim Jong-un years. And more recently, I've also seen in 2 provincial cities huge trampolines installed, and the children are really using these. Family life, very important. And then most people think North Korea has to be a very grim country. That's not true. North Koreans love to party, to organize picnics, to sing and dance, and to have a good time. And they all can sing. How quickly had I to learn my 2 Swiss songs? Very embarrassing. Card games or fishing is popular. Youngsters in Pyongyang go roller skating or play frisbee. Beer drinking is for men only. And then, of course, sports, football, ping pong, to name a few. And North Koreans like music, also classical music, and many can play an instrument. And the Pyongyang Symphony Orchestra has given some great concerts. I remember one where we also had a Swiss piano players visiting us. And then every 2 years there is the International Film Festival, a very popular event, especially for youngsters. When I was there at SDC, we always participated with 1 or 2 Swiss films, and I spent hours trying to find the right one, which they would understand. Of course, it's not a happy picture everywhere. Also, overall, I am of the opinion that the situation in the country has improved modestly in recent years. That said, the longer the sanctions last, the greater the impact will be felt by ordinary people. It is a downward chain to the poor. And sanctions should, in reality, not harm those who have already a very hard life. And they should also not harm non-governmental organizations or the UN, basically humanitarian aid. But I can tell you we have a lot of problems, which I don't want to go into here right now. So what are the main difficulties today? North Korea is still a poor country. There is continued food insecurity, energy shortage, water and sanitation problems, health issues, and a dilapidated infrastructure. Aid is still needed if we aim at improving the well-being of the North Korean people, and if we want to contribute to opening and developing the country and give the poor also a chance. Peace, stability, and prosperity on the Korean Peninsula, I would say even in Northeast Asia, is an aim worth working for. We need to build bridges and not walls. And with that, I close now and hand over to Nico. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. I mean, you've basically answered all my questions, so.
I don't think so, knowing you. I don't think so.
No, but I think this was great because, again, it's so easy to forget how complex life is in any place in the world, including North Korea, and that just happens to be a country where we have an incredibly sort of skewed view of, because also information flow is a little bit restricted. You said something, I think it was a few years ago at, incidentally, another Asia Society event in San Francisco, and you said that the changes in North Korea could be sort of summarized by the 6 M's, and they are markets, money, mobile phones, motor cars, middle class, and mindset. And I see kind of how you added the M to the cars. Elegantly done. But I think that's a really nice, it's a really nice summary. Also shows you how that change is actually fairly broad. So let's maybe, you mentioned many of these already, so let's maybe just deepen a little bit that and start with the markets and the money. And there's one thing that you mentioned before, you already mentioned it at lunch, and kind of bumped on that. You said there are 5 taxi companies in Pyongyang and they're competing with each other. And so the word I was kind of like struck by is the competing. So if they're all owned by the government, how will they compete?
There are different government bodies owning the taxi companies. So it's government, plus there is sometimes also certain private investment in that. Some cars are leased from China, so they have to pay back China for the leasing fee. So there is competition, and that's something we didn't have in 1995 when I started going there. In those days, basically everybody also wanted to be the same, be from behavior, but also dress code, everything. It was, you know, a big similarity across board. That's gone now.
So in a way, the society has become much more individualistic as well, as a result maybe of this somewhat limited marketization.
I would say the family still plays a very important role, and it's not just the family, it's the whole clan. So that's very, you know, Asian and Confucian societies. So that's still there. But there is more individualism now than there was before. And also money plays a role now, which didn't play much a role some 12 years ago or 10 years ago. And I'll give you an example. I would ask my colleagues, so how much is a pair of shoes? So that I had some idea, and he would look at me and say, I don't know. And I thought, oh, he doesn't want to tell me. until I figured out he has no idea because the work unit has distributed the shoes. That's all gone nowadays. People know exactly what things cost because there are markets and they have also dreams of buying stuff there, which is a bit different from the stuff that is handed out by the government.
You also mentioned mobile phones, but then also said, and I think that's it's almost impossible, I think, for us to imagine how there can be a mobile phone that doesn't have internet. But you might remember those, they existed not too long ago. So how have mobile phones without internet access, just the sheer, like, simple, old, I guess, like, are they North Korean made, by the way, the mobile phones? Chinese made. So how have those changed, how have changed daily life society, how have they made it easier to live if there's no, it's apparently not about information access because they still can't access outside information through the mobile phones, or not easily.
What it has done is that it has improved the communication within the North Korean society. Before it was very difficult to perhaps speak to your family members who live on the other side of the country. Now they can use a mobile phone. Letter writing seems a bit like here, totally forgotten. So it's really, mobile phone is the way to communicate. They cannot phone abroad, but as one of my colleagues said to me, I don't have anybody abroad, who would I phone? You know, we need to look at it from that perspective too. But it does make a huge difference. So basically there are two mobile phone systems. For us foreigners, we can rent the phone and a SIM card, or we can just get a SIM card, but I'm always scared of bugs, so I rent both, the phone and the SIM card. And then I can phone abroad, people can phone me back, and I can phone other foreigners in the country. And I once couldn't help it, I phoned my colleague in Washington. He nearly fell off his chair. So you always have surprises in North Korea.
From what you tell us, it seems that, although that's probably changing a little bit now, but it seems that it's still, in an economic sense, a somewhat, if not egalitarian, then kind of like equal society. Everybody has like a job that they're being allocated. I'm sure there's differences in income, but I'm assuming compared, for example, to China, where those differences have become huge, it's still somewhat limited. Is that still the case, or is there a small elite somewhere that has a lot more money and also a lot more abilities to work with that money?
I wouldn't say it's an elite. It's a small middle class who has made some money. Also right now, because of the sanctions, that is unfortunately falling apart. Because what happens very often, of a couple, one works for the government, which means you have a roof over your head, and the other one does some business. And that's how they can make some money. And then doing some business can mean opening a restaurant, for example, or trading with some stuff imported from China. It can also mean transporting goods from A to B with a little hand cart. I mean, there are many, many ways. But as an example, when I was at SDC, we had the Pyongyang Business School, which usually surprises people that there's something like a Pyongyang Business School. We had to stop it because our parliament didn't agree to development cooperation, so we had to go back to humanitarian aid, so the business school has fallen wayside. But anyway, that was a business school where we would train 35 middle managers for a period of 1 year, and every month we had a 4-day intensive workshop with lecturers flown in from the Hong Kong Management Association. And it was highly appreciated. And once I was somewhere in Pyongyang, a car stopped, a gentleman jumped out of the car and thanked me profoundly for what I had done, and I had absolutely no idea. And at the end he said, my wife attended the business school and she has now a restaurant. Why don't you go there tomorrow evening?
Did you?
Of course I did, yes. I have to find out what's going on.
You mentioned the middle class, of course. And it seems to me that when a middle class emerges in a country, in a society, they're not only doing better economically, that also changes a little bit the ambitions that they have in life. So what are the North Koreans' emerging middle class ambitions and dreams? What is considered a good, successful middle class life?
I think we are not yet there. It's really, I can earn some money, and I can buy perhaps nicer clothing for my kids, or I can take them out to an amusement park where they charge entrance. You know, it's not comparable with our middle class, but it's certainly different to what it used to be. And that's where actually my 6M come in, which I only added later, that I felt mindsets are changing. And that is particularly the case among the younger generation. Those who grew up or were born during the famine years and now are young adults or teenagers, they are no longer used that government is providing everything. For them, it's the most natural thing. We have to make ends meet. So they have a much more entrepreneurial spirit. And that's what I mean by mindsets changing.
But it would seem to me, if there is a younger generation that has a more entrepreneurial mindset, that wants to build their own lives, careers, etc., wouldn't that eventually mean that that their attitude towards their government would change? Because it's not seen anymore as the provider of everything and the controlling entity of its entire life. So would there not have to be at some point more skepticism also towards that government?
I think right now government is still the enabler, you know. Kim Jong-un has definitely given them a bit more freedom to do things. Especially marketization has improved a lot or has grown. So that's the situation right now. The rest, again, I think it's tea leaf reading.
So, but what you're saying is in a way that the marketization, at least for now, has, to the extent that that's possible, improved the government's standing and reputation because people see their lives getting better. And while that's happening through marketization, they would still credit the government for that.
I would say so, up to a certain point at least. But let me also say, and they would blame, rightly so, the sanctions, because right now it's much more difficult to do business, to import stuff from China, even to work for a humanitarian aid agency is more complicated because we don't get the stuff in anymore because we can't find a forwarder who is willing to deliver to Pyongyang. So, things have, instead of progressed, are gradually moving down, and I just hope the sanctions will not go on forever.
The picture you're painting of life in North Korea, again, it seems like there's lots of change going on. It's still at a very early stage. Life is still not maybe very comfortable, but still there seems to be, from what you're telling us, from this evidence, circumstantial evidence, there is, in a way, on maybe a low-level economic improvement. Are there any reliable statistics that would back up that impression? Do we know actually how the North Korean economy is doing overall? Not
necessarily. There is a lot of guesswork to that, and that's why people really ask us who live there, go there regularly to be the boots on the ground, basically, and find out what's going on. But there is also a big difference between rural and urban areas. Urban areas are much more behind. And, farming is still done by hand with oxen. Right now, there is a petrol or diesel shortage. Spare parts can't come in. So in some areas, we are moving backwards.
Would you say that the sort of pace of economic development over the last, let's say, 2 to 3 years, when there was also this very intense phase, it seems now, looking back, of nuclear buildup, did it have any impact? Did the economic development slow down? Did it increase? So what was sort of the more recent development? Is it the curve kind of like flattening, or is it actually going up?
It was going up. I would say it's flattening, if not slowly dipping, because only during my last couple of trips I felt the sanctions were really having an impact. Before, I felt things were still moving forward.
Let's maybe move on. I think we've gotten now a very comprehensive and also very complex sort of view of how daily life is in North Korea, how it has changed, and of course the question is like what brought these changes into life? What were the factors that actually allowed those changes to happen? I think a lot of analysis usually focuses on outside external factors, whether that's China or whether it's South Korea or international development. But I want to start actually, we've touched upon this a little bit already, I want to start with the effect that changes in government policy inside the country actually had. So you hinted at Kim Jong-un, like opening up a little bit. So can you tell us a little bit like what effect in the overall picture did conscious choices that the North Korean government made actually have on this sort of gradual development and opening up that we're seeing?
The government still doesn't like to call it reforms, so I usually say changes, but it goes towards that direction. It actually started with some changes in the agricultural sector, and there I also realized even if there is a bit more freedom to do things, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's followed across the board. Some farm managers were much more afraid to bring about changes, and others felt, let's try it. So there's also a difference almost from farm to farm, how much they go or move forward. And then also factories have more freedom. They can hire people, they can set the salaries. Again, it's not across the board. Some rather cling to the old system because they feel more secure with that system. So it's a process that also takes time.
And are those reforms that the government doesn't like to call reforms, are they doing them or have they done them because out of sheer necessity, because otherwise they would have had to face a lot of human suffering? Or is there another reason why all of a sudden, maybe not all of a sudden, but why we had those changes happening when before, for a very long time, the country and its population did very, very badly, and it seemed that did not, incentivize the government to do anything?
There are many reasons, I would say, and one is also that government has figured out if they give the people incentives, the work attitude is different.
They probably learned it at Pyongyang Business School.
Wishful thinking. But that's a reality, and I think that's one thing which started to sink in, and then it was necessity too, because the state could no longer provide for everything. So let the people find their own way, and that's what happened. And so gradually the tolerance level of these private activities, or semi-private, sometimes they're organized in some sort of collectivism still, or cooperatives. Government has simply turned a blind eye to that and let them do it. And so those with more courage do more than others who are still quite afraid to do so.
You mentioned, I think, very difficult circumstances under which international aid, development aid, humanitarian aid is happening in the country. What was the effect, or still is the effect, of that international aid in the development of the country? You mentioned, I think, before the potatoes. You told me earlier that apparently there was a Swiss program that tried to teach North Koreans how to grow potatoes, because we're good at that. So what is the role of international aid in the development of the country?
Well, the sad story is that because of the political situation, North Korea does not get development cooperation. So we are back to humanitarian aid, where in development cooperation you look more at long-term issues. You try to solve the problem, where with humanitarian aid it's more putting a plaster onto the wound. The North Koreans would love development cooperation because they know that's the only way to move forward. So some of the projects today are what I would call hybrids, and I commend organizations who are trying to do that, because prevention is better than cure. But right now, aid is almost insignificant. I give you an example. 5 UN agencies and 5 NGOs ask for, I think it was around 120 million US dollars for a 1-year program. They got 40%. 40%. So it's a very tough decision then. Who do you cut out from aid that is very much needed? And that's what's happening right now. Donors are very reluctant to provide any aid, especially companies, because they don't want anywhere in their books the word North Korea appearing, because then sanctions kick in. So we depend a lot on private donors, and the UN, of course, on the UN system.
One actor in this, I guess, like the bigger North Korea question that usually is agreed that has played a big role is China. And of course, if there is trade going on between North Korea and any other country, it probably is almost exclusively with China. Now, there's an argument that what has happened on the North Korea-China border has mostly made a very small part of the North Korean elite, the North Korean 1%. John Park was here last week, calls them North Korea Incorporated, very, very rich, because they were able to circumvent or evade sanctions or even sort of leverage the sanctions to their goals. So has this somewhat gradual opening of China, which I think in recent years has been reduced again, has it had an overall positive effect on North Korea, or maybe even a negative effect? Is it good that there is trade with China to the extent that it exists, or is it even maybe problematic because it just leads to a lot of inequality and corruption?
I would go, it's a good thing, because you can't exist in isolation, and that's what we are trying to do, to put North Korea back into the box so that they don't develop, that they stay poor. So trade with anybody, I think, is a good thing if you do it properly.
Are they doing it properly with China?
I think the North Koreans also look at South Korea, and chaebols is some model which they have seen in South Korea too. And if you know the few companies that are in power of South Korea, North Korea is probably not much different, only that they are government companies and not private, semi-private companies in South Korea. And China has never provided much aid, just little drops. It has always been business. Sometimes barter trade, because North Korea has some very precious raw materials from rare earth, the most precious one, and many, many others. So North Korea is interesting for China, Japan, South Korea, Russia, the surrounding countries, basically. The problem is, right now, because of the dilapidated infrastructure, they cannot exploit their raw materials. But that will come, I'm very sure.
How would that work? So if it comes, and let's assume sanctions are still in place, how can they actually exploit that?
Not as long as sanctions are in place, but I think I was in South Korea end of March, early April. They are waiting for the sanctions to be relaxed, because they also would very much like to revitalize the Kaesong Industrial Park, where there were over 50,000 workers, North Korean workers, for about, I think, 200 small and medium-scale South Korean companies. And South Korea would send the managers, and North Korea would provide the workers. So that's for South Korea very interesting, because the labor force is not as expensive as it is in South Korea or China.
Let's maybe talk a little bit about South Korea. I guess the North-South relations on the Korean Peninsula would be a topic for an entire event in itself, and we should probably do that at some point. But maybe here just for a few minutes, how do you think right now, you spend a lot of time in both countries, how do the people in both countries view each other? There's obviously a lot of shared history, there's a lot of pain, but there's also right now surprisingly little contact. So do they know anything about each other? What are their attitudes towards each other right now?
I think the summit between President Moon and Kim Jong-un has helped quite a lot to present Kim Jong-un in a different picture, because I think he did quite well at the summit in the DMZ. But overall, I would say there is a huge generation gap in South Korea. The older generation has mixed feelings. Some would very much like to see unifications. Others say, I still own land up there and I get that back. So you have that too, which doesn't really signal a very peaceful unification if you go and want your land back. And the younger generation, I do give lectures at universities in South Korea too, they say, if they let us in peace, we let them in peace. It's 70 years, I don't blame them. They know next to nothing about North Korea. Plus, there is also a very strong security law in South Korea. They are not allowed to to check websites about North Korea. And when I was teaching at Stanford, I taught a class or a course on North Korea, and I had quite a number of South Korean students. Did they love that, to get so much information? Were they happy if I could tell them, look at that web page? They could do it in Stanford, but not in their own country. So I think on both sides, a lot need to be changed if we want a peaceful unification. Personally, I think the two countries should aim at peaceful coexistence and gradually get to know each other. And then when both sides feel unification is the right thing, then go for it. But a quick unification, I would be deeply concerned, and not just because of the costs.
Which is interesting. I think there was a story today or yesterday in the Nikkei Asian Review, and if I remember correctly, the costs, they were talking a lot about a possible unification, and the cost of a North-South Korea reunification were put at about $5 trillion. Which is quite a significant number, and I guess all the more reason why, if that is a process, it should be a long process. So you've talked about the South Korean kind of attitudes towards the North. What's the other side? Right now we're seeing kind of like a global wave of K-pop, which translates into a lot of South Korean soft power all of a sudden. Is that happening in the North as well? Is that kind of like the South Korean culture being perceived at all? Is it accessible?
Accessible is another thing, but after some rapprochement, two concerts, one of which was a K-pop concert, was held in North Korea, in Pyongyang, and Kim Jong-un and his wife attended. That was quite a step, but that does not mean that everybody knows about K-pop, that everybody likes K-pop. One of my colleagues, actually quite angry, he said, they are singing our songs. Interesting remark. So to me, it just signals how deep the gap is and how much work needs to be done. And that's why, people-to-people contacts are so important. That's the only way that they learn to understand each other better.
We've come, over the course of this conversation, I think we stumbled upon one topic many, many times, which are the sanctions that are still in place against North Korea. And I kind of take it from your remarks that you feel that, first of all, they very obviously have not helped the country. They did not maybe achieve their goals. They were bad for the population. So would you overall say that the sanctions have failed or are failing?
I would say I'm not totally against sanctions if they are targeted sanctions, but we have gone way beyond that. To me, it feels like when diplomacy fails, we slap on new sanctions, and I soon cannot think of what else could be sanctions. Also, Trump said if the summit fails, he has 100 sanctions in his drawer. So they haven't achieved what they were intended to achieve. North Korea has not stopped their nuclear and missile program. They wanted to achieve a level. They decided where it had to be, and we felt that was the signal we got towards the end of last year, that they had reached the level. And that's one of the reasons why I think they now feel we are strong enough to negotiate. But it's not the only reason. I think the other reason, the military threats from the US also had an impact, and as I said earlier on, that the sanctions gradually start to bite. So it's a combination of these three things why I think they are willing to talk. But signals to talk, Kim Jong-un has given not just in last year's New Year's address, already in the previous one.
Let's maybe, sort of as we slowly come towards an end of this part of the conversation, talk about Switzerland's relationship also with the North, which I think has been around for a long time. And you've been very deeply involved in that process. You've talked a little bit about it before. Talk to us maybe a little bit how that works. So how does a country like Switzerland, this non-threatening, small, neutral, rich country, navigate the minefield, the diplomatic minefield that are relationships with North Korea? And at least it seems to me from the outside that we probably have done a quite okay job as a country of providing, to the extent that was possible, support and aid and development to the country. How does Switzerland do that?
First of all, Switzerland established diplomatic relations with any country that wants diplomatic relations, and we have done that more than 40 years ago. And over the years, I think relationships were built and trust was established. And as you just mentioned, we are a small country, we don't have strategic interests, we are not in the European Union, we are not in NATO. This all plays a role in the relationship. And of course, our aid has always been very much appreciated. In fact, when North Korea reached out for aid in 1995 after the terrible floods, they approached the United Nations and Switzerland to come and assess the damages. So that was also a sign of trust vis-à-vis Switzerland. Of course, negotiations with North Korea are never easy, and you have to be tough. That's important. It's not always nice. You have to be tough. You reach more that way, otherwise you are easily taken for a ride.
Speaking of negotiations with North Korea, I think we've managed to go almost 1 hour without really mentioning the Singapore summit that's coming up on Tuesday, so that time ends now. And before we move to audience Q&A, I'd love to hear maybe a few words about that summit. You mentioned earlier today when we spoke that not too long ago, last year, sort of, like the threat of escalation and even military conflict was actually very, very high. And it seems that in a surprisingly short period of time, regardless of what the summit brings, we've kind of like moved away from that, and everybody seems to feel a little bit calmer now. So if you look towards next Tuesday, what are your expectations? What can we realistically expect to come out of the summit? What would be like? What's the minimum viable summit outcome?
Oh dear!
I know it's tea leaf reading, but that's what we do professionally here.
Right. I see basically 4 scenarios. One is success. Kim Jong-un decides to give up the nuclear program in order to secure North Korea's economic future and the support of the US for his continued rule of North Korea. I don't think that will happen.
I was about to ask, how many fractions of a percent probability would you give that scenario?
I leave that to the audience.
Okay, good.
And then on the other spectrum, we have a failure or a breakdown. President Trump plays tough, threatens Kim Jong-un to either give up the nuclear weapons or there will be more sanctions, those 100 in his drawer, and more hardship for the North Korean people, and the risk that the regime is at stake. Kim Jong-un feels pushed around and says, that's not the way I want to be treated, does not agree. Trump blames Kim Jong-un for this wonderful offer he has made. Kim Jong-un withdraws. President Moon then tries to find a way resuming the dialogue between the two. Escalation grows. Bolton feels happy. Military option is back on the table. That's the worst case scenario. And then in between, I would say we have two. An outcome with some concrete steps. They agreed to denuclearization with some concrete steps, perhaps that the atomic energy inspectors can go back in, that the production of nuclear weapons and missiles is halted. The US offers economic aid, some sanctions are lifted, the US opens a liaison office in Pyongyang. Well, that would be quite positive. But we could also have an inconclusive outcome. Trump and Kim agree that denuclearization is the final goal, but no decisions of specific future steps can be made. They agreed to stay in touch with negotiation teams from both sides, instructions to work on out the details. It's presented in the world as the big success, and a long and difficult process starts. But even if we have that outcome, I'm happy, because the worst case scenario is really the military threat. And I must say, President Moon, with his interactions, managed to get that, at least for the time being, off the table. Tea leaf reading, please.